Thanks for joining us for the 10th in our My Farm to ECE mini webinar series. Today we'll be talking about using Farm to ECE programs to celebrate cultural relevancy in early childhood programs. On the webinar today is myself, Abby Harper. I'm the Farm to School Specialist at the MSU Center for Regional Food Systems. And with me is Caitlin Wojak, Community Food Systems Educator with MSU Extension. And before we start, I just want to place a caveat in here. Caitlin and I are both really excited about sharing some ideas for how you can use Farm to ECE to celebrate children's cultures. But I want to acknowledge that we are both white women in presenting this material. And so we're really presenting this only from our viewpoint and want to respect that other people may have different views as to how to use cultural relevancy in their programs or even what cultural relevancy means. We're very excited to have a discussion about that at the end if people are interested. But I just want to highlight that we are approaching this as white women, thinking about how to create programming that celebrates a lot of different cultures, many of which may not be our own. So to start, I just want to provide a little bit of an overview on what we're defining as cultural relevancy today. And as I mentioned, other people may define this differently. Cultural relevancy is basically the idea that programs should create an atmosphere that reflects the language and culture of the children and their families. It creates an environment of celebration around different cultures and can help validate children's identity and create stronger connections to families and communities that are represented in the program. It can also create an environment of inclusion that supports children's social and emotional development. And in this, I really want to emphasize that the first step in creating culturally relevant programming is to really get to know the cultures of the children that you work with and their families. For some providers, that can come from similar backgrounds to the children that they serve. This may seem like an easier to accomplish aspect, but for myself, for example, as a white woman, I may need to do some additional learning to better understand the places and cultures that those I work with come from. And this can help create a shared understanding of family and community culture, as well as I mentioned, really help validate children's lived experiences and create greater connections to what's happening in the house and what's happening in the program. So why are we talking about cultural relevancy in Farm to ECE? Well, as you probably know, there's a very strong link between culture and food, particularly in the United States, which is such a mixing bowl of cultures. Many people use food to maintain traditions to their cultural identities and countries of origin. And food can have meaning beyond, beyond nutrition and sustenance. It can have connections to special events, to family traditions, to cultural values. So it can really be a tool for celebrating cultural diversity in a program. And particularly for folks that may have recently immigrated to the U.S., for immigrants and refugees, or folks that are here temporarily, like the children of migrant and seasonal farm workers, celebrating culturally relevant foods can really be an opportunity to make connections to their identity. And in that, food can be used as a tool to celebrate that cultural diversity. And particularly when we're thinking about exposing children to new foods, making connections between what they're experiencing at home and in the classroom can be a tool for ensuring that children have greater receptivity to new foods and that they're foods that they may see in the home as well as in their programs. So Farm to ECE, therefore, because of that focus on food and local food in particular, can really be a tool for accessing culturally relevant foods and teaching about food and nutrition in ways that are culturally relevant. And so today, Caitlin and I are going to give some examples of how food can be used to support cultural relevancy and what that might look like in different programs. And I'll have some examples to share as well. So here are some ways that local food purchasing can support creating those culturally relevant programs. The first is that by purchasing local food, you might be able to access foods that are culturally relevant to communities you work with that you may not have access to through your standard channels. So for example, if there are populations that you work with that there are particular greens that are culturally relevant or particular varieties of peppers or particular spices that you may not be able to get at a grocery store or your broadline distributor, there are ways to work with farmers to be able to request particular products that you might not be able to have access to otherwise. And I think that's a really unique benefit of working with local farmers that you don't have access to working through maybe larger distributors, is that you can really work with them to identify products that are relevant to your communities and that they can change their growing practices to make those available to you. Another way that cultural relevancy can look in local food purchasing is by preparing new foods and new local foods that you bring in ways that are culturally relevant to the populations that you serve. So for example, preparing perhaps some new vegetables that aren't traditionally in a curry if you serve a population, if you serve children that are from India or Indian, or preparing different new vegetables in a stir fry that may be more culturally relevant to certain children. And another way that local food purchasing can connect to cultural relevancy is by purchasing from farmers in your community or purchasing from farmers that are reflective of your community. And I'll have an example in a minute of a program that's doing that. So these are all ways that you can really utilize local food purchasing to celebrate the cultures of your children and to create more culturally relevant programming. And I do want to emphasize that if you're working with Head Start programs, they have particular resources around creating culturally relevant programming, specifically around curriculum and language and classroom activities. And local food purchasing and celebrating culture and food can really be a way to reinforce some of those standards that are already present. So I have a couple examples of what farm to early care and education looks like in action that's really honoring culturally relevant programming. The first is Calusa Indian Childcare, which is a Native American childcare in California. And they're accessing cultural relevancy through local food in a couple of ways. The first is by honoring the tradition of some of the tribal populations they work with of gardening, and their tribes have a long history of gardening and living off the land. So they place a lot of emphasis on having on-site gardens, and in that also sharing stories. So they really place an emphasis around families sharing stories about their connections to different foods and different special occasions in the tribe that revolve around food. Another example I want to briefly highlight is the Community Action Partnership of Ramsey and Washington County. These are in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, and they're a Head Start program that has started to work with Hmong American Farmers Association and been able to build some really unique community connections there and learn more about the types of vegetables that the Hmong population are growing. And in that, they also have a lot of children in their Head Start programs that are Hmong as well. So it's a really unique connection to be able to learn from those Hmong farmers and be able to serve some of those foods that may be more familiar to some of the Hmong children in their communities, as well as introduce those children that aren't Hmong to some of the traditional foods. A couple other examples I want to highlight from Michigan. Michigan Migrant and Seasonal Head Start, there are a few programs that have been increasing local food purchasing on the western side of the state and are really connecting with some of the farmers that employ their family members to be able to provide some local food in their programming. And in addition to that, they've coupled their local food purchasing with some field trips to local farms that employ many of the children's parents, which provides a really great connection and loop so that the children are really connected to the work that their parents are doing and have access to some of that food that they might not have access to otherwise. And the other one I want to highlight is from Baxter Child Development Center in Grand Rapids. They do a lot of local purchasing, and in some of their plans to expand, they're looking at ways that their vendors can more accurately reflect the populations that they serve, which is a really neat way to look at cultural relevancy as well, to be able to really tailor your purchasing to make sure that the populations you serve are represented in the vendors that you're supporting as well. And with that, I'll pass it over to Caitlin, who can talk a little bit about cultural relevancy in gardens.
So gardens are a space that are full of possibility to explore connections between food and culture. They offer ways of providing culturally relevant food and educational programming. And here I'm just going to share a few ideas of how your program might approach building connections to the garden through a culturally relevant lens. I'll just say that these points are adapted from an article I wrote from my perspective, which is white. And I hope that there are some useful threads here for all, and I want to acknowledge that I don't have the experience of a person of color working within their own community on this topic. So with all of that, the first point here might seem a little bit like a given, but it is important to first understand who your students are and what their cultural backgrounds are to incorporate the garden in a culturally relevant way. It's also useful to consider who of your students is eager to participate and who might be more reserved. It's helpful with that to be conscious of cultural norms around the garden and finding ways for all students to participate in activities in a way that's comfortable for them. And in terms of parent inclusion, the garden can be an excellent way to deepen relationships with parents, relatives, or guardians. Inviting family members of your students to share more about their food culture is a way to encourage family participation, expose students to authentic sources of cultural knowledge, and when thoughtfully and intentionally done, it can be a respectful way of honoring cultural backgrounds in your program. One thing to note here is that it might be disrespectful in your invitation or your approach to ask one person from a culture to speak for their entire group. So that's just something to be conscious of as you're inviting engagement from parents and family members. And then in terms of what you're growing in your garden, engaging parents or relatives in the process to determine what to grow in the garden can be another way to access cultural knowledge. Naturally, it's best to be considerate of how much you're asking from your students' families. But if families are willing to be engaged, they can play a part in determining what plants will grow in your region that can be incorporated into your cultural programming and eating. And then lastly, it's important to build reflection into your process with the garden and with everything else that we've already covered. So every so often, it's good to take stock on whether your garden program is embodying respectful ways of highlighting different cultures, building trusting relationships with your students and families, and what you can do to improve those approaches. Asking for another perspective from a trusted parent or a student family member can be a way to get more feedback on your approach. So we'll switch gears just to briefly cover then culturally relevant farm to ECE education. And thankfully, there are now a number of books that focus on non-white cultures, which are really great additions to your classroom library, particularly when they're representative of your students' cultures. So one example of this is in North Carolina, where the farm to child care coordinators are working with local libraries to aggregate a list of children's books that highlight foods from different cultures. And then they're providing this list to early childhood programs throughout the state. And another way to incorporate food is by having taste tests that feature culturally relevant food, perhaps even with food that you grew in your garden, if that's possible. And this is another place where working with parents and families to get ideas or the lowdown on how to prepare a specific dish can be really beneficial.
Great, thanks so much. So from there, we'd love to hear questions or ideas from you. If anyone has a question, you can type it into the chat box, but we'd also love to hear if any of you have experience using local food to really celebrate children's culture in your programs. So please chime in with stories or questions. We've got about 5 minutes here to be a part of, yeah. And I do want to emphasize, so Caitlin wrote a great article on this in MSU Extension that you all can access. And I'm also working with some coworkers on a guide for migrant and seasonal Head Start programs. And we're trying to make more resources that are really targeted to different cultures to make sure that farm to ECE is accessible to a lot of different populations. All right. Caitlin, quick question for you. Have you seen any programs that are really using gardens to celebrate culture? Oh, we had some questions. Okay, we had a couple questions come in. There was a question about the North Carolina book list. We're doing the same thing and don't want to duplicate activities. I think they're really just in the starting phases. Janice, I don't know where you're based. I'd love to talk with you further about it. If you want to email me, my email is herperab@msu.edu on there. And I definitely don't think that one state doing it means that everyone else, oh, Food Trust in Philadelphia, that's awesome. I definitely think that there is benefit to having multiple people working on similar projects, but I'd be really happy to connect you with the folks in North Carolina that I spoke with that are developing this list, so that you guys can talk further and maybe collaborate. And then April, there was a question about using foods not of the culture, but in culturally familiar ways. And I'm guessing that that is in reference to sort of preparations that are culturally familiar. I think that can be a really great way to introduce kids to new local foods by preparing them ways that are culturally familiar. So, you know, thinking about maybe different greens that you might purchase, or maybe you know, different vegetables that you might get from a local farmer. I'm thinking kohlrabi in particular is one that seems to be new to kids. So it could be a really great way to help introduce that food if you prepare it in ways that are familiar to the culture, for sure. I don't know if that answered your question, but and then there was another question from Philadelphia. Hi, everybody. About any examples of partnerships with urban farms and community gardens as a way of adding capacity or intergenerational connections. Do you have any thoughts on that, Caitlin?
Well, I think that the Baxter Community Center is working, they have a garden on site at their program, and they involve students of ages beyond, like early care, to get older students working in the garden as well. And then I think that they also have a partnership with a community garden, and they have found that to be really beneficial. I also think that there might be examples of this in Detroit. I can't think of any particular gardens, but the organization Keep Growing Detroit, which you might be familiar with, has a lot of connections with community gardens and has in the past really focused on networking with school gardens and community gardens and building those intergenerational connections and exposure. So if you'd be interested, I'd be happy to connect you afterwards with someone from their organization to see if we can get some more specifics on how that looks.
Yeah, no problem. Great. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, with that, I just want to